Afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Digby, and thanks, Tiki. That's quite an act to follow. After that. As my talk says, it's about Durban's estuaries, their status, threats, and future. A lot of this work is built on some work that was done by Tiki and Nicolette from Marine Estuarine Research a few years back, and just expanding on in terms of the threats and what the future holds for these systems. Right, so in around 2005, 2006, a report was completed by Dr. Mark Graham from Ground Truth, looking at the state of rivers in Durban, and it raised immediate alarm bells about the state of our aquatic ecosystems. He had 55 sampling sites using SAS biomonitoring techniques, and he found that only 2 of the 55 sites could be considered to be in relatively good condition, and around 50% of those sites were considered to be in their lowest ecological status. So it immediately raised concerns about other systems, and in particular estuaries, which obviously sit at the end of catchments. They're integrators of land-based drainage, and therefore fairly good indicators of what the entire catchment is looking like. So this ultimately culminated in the appointment of Marine and Estuarine Research in 2007 to undertake a study of Durban 16 systems, primarily looking at updating information, in many cases providing baseline ecological information on these systems, as well as also looking at ecological status of these estuaries and possible management interventions. Right, so in terms of Durban, the whole metro boundary is around 2,300 square kilometers, which equates to just under 2% of the total land area in the province. Added to that, we've got around a third of the human population, so we're dealing with a highly populated environment, number of threats facing these systems. Along our 100 kilometers of coastline, we've got 16 estuarine systems, which equates to around a quarter of the estuaries within the province. And breaking that down, and I actually saw I've made a mistake here, we've actually got 4 estuarine types. There's 14 temporary open-closed estuaries, 1 permanently open estuary, and 1 estuarine bay, or with the diversity in terms of catchment sizes and level of threat facing them. We've got systems like the Umkomaas, which has its origins in the Drakensberg, and then we've got tiny systems with catchment sizes of no more than 10 square kilometers. So yeah, these results are directly from the Estuaries of Durban report, which Marine Estuarine Research produced, and if you want any more details on it, just chat to me, or you can go to the municipal websites and go and download it. Again, similar to the rivers, the major issue was that we didn't have one system that could be considered to be in excellent condition. 3 systems were considered to be good, and they're not particularly surprising. They're the furthest away from the city centre and the largely rural areas. The other 4 systems in the southern section were also classified as fair, again largely away from urbanisation. And then we started to move towards systems that were showing levels of degradation. The Mshloti and Mshlonga, as Tiki was describing, around wastewater being the major issue. 5 of the other temporary open-closed estuaries were classified as highly degraded. And of particular concern was our 2 largest systems, and only representatives of their respective types, the Umgani and Durban Bay. They were classified as highly degraded. So taking a look at more specifically some of the threats that are facing these systems, in recent times we've had the use of the 5-meter contour, which has come into effect, which is basically used for delineating estuarine environments. This is taken from a report that Jane Turpey completed quite recently, and that the area includes the dynamic processes that typify estuarine systems, namely changes in channel morphology, sediment stored or eroded during floods, and changes as a consequence of coastal storms. It also includes estuarine and floodplain vegetation, habitats which are obviously critical to maintaining estuarine function. In addition, as Tiki was describing, in temporary open-closed estuaries, there's often a large sandbar which develops across the mouth of these systems. In the case of KZN systems, the maximum height is around 4.5 meters. So essentially when an estuary closes and fills up and backfloods behind the estuary, the sandbar, it reaches that level. So the 5-meter contour includes that process, while also allowing for a buffer in terms of sea level rise. As I mentioned earlier, we've had massive transformation across the EMA, the eThekwini municipal area, in terms of within the 5-meter contour. I just did some sums last night, and we're looking at around 61% of areas within the 5 metre contour haven't been already transformed. So lots of issues in terms of that. This is Durban Bay, and this was taken from a paper from David Allen and Alistair McInnes. And this looks at basically the attrition of the bay and what's happened to the habitats within them. When you look at the actual stats, we've lost around 95% of the mangrove communities, 87% of our intertidal sandbanks, and around a similar figure for the natural shoreline areas. So given that Sticky was mentioning earlier that we've only got 2 of these in the subtropical zone and 3 in the country, it's pretty damning evidence in terms of what's happened to the system. Then you take another look and look at a system like the Mzimbazi, which is classified as good, and this is the 5 metre contour overlaid onto the aerial, and it's kind of told me 2 things. Firstly, intuitively it looks like the 5 metre contour is actually correct in terms of delineating estuarine areas. But secondly, that development and estuarine functioning are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In the case of here, there's been a natural respect of that boundary, and I don't think it's any coincidence that it's actually not within a formal town planning scheme. It's largely in the rural areas that this is. Right, so in terms of the 5 metre contour, this is now literally the line in the sand for our departments in terms of our impact assessment team who deal with applications on a daily basis. Any application that exists within the 5 metre contour and we comment on will generally get a negative comment. In terms of our biodiversity plan team, this information is integrated within all our spatial plans, from our IDP down to our local area plans. But as I mentioned earlier, I mean, obviously, given that we've got a 61% transformation level within the 5 metre contour, and if we are serious about achieving some of these conservation targets, which Sticky was alluding to just now, then we actually have to go down the routes of restoration and rehabilitation of habitats in order to reach some of these targets. There are opportunities, definitely through appropriate zonings and also the Integrated Coastal Management Act. There's provision for the gazetting of a coastal setback line, which would include estuarine areas. It's obviously, it hasn't been gazetted as yet, but hopefully in the not too distant future. You can speak to Omar, I'm sure, afterwards, and he'll tell you how it's doing. Right, moving on to eutrophication. Discharge of human effluents, application of fertilizers, and changes in land use have all contributed to movement and mobilization of nitrogen and phosphorus within our catchments. The stimulation of phytoplankton or algal blooms following this nutrient enrichment leads to an imbalance between primary and secondary production. And the resulting increase in sedimentation of organic matter promotes microbial decomposition, which ultimately leads to changes in oxygen concentrations. So systems affected by eutrophications are typically characterized by extreme fluctuations in dissolved oxygen concentrations, which has major impacts, ecological impacts. The most obvious here is an example of a fish kill in Durban Bay in 2007. But there are a lot more subtle ecosystem effects which dissolved oxygen can play in the system. We find a very strong correlation between oxygen concentrations and benthic invertebrate communities, and systems that were subjected to eutrophication tended to have highly impoverished communities, a relatively few number of species, and generally oxygen tolerant. Again, not surprisingly, some of the results from the study showed that nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations in our systems were amongst the highest ever recorded in South Africa. Phytoplankton blooms were evident in a number of estuaries, particularly, as Tiki mentioned, some of the smaller systems, which are obviously far more susceptible to the effects of eutrophication, and particularly those systems with wastewater treatment works on them. Receiving environments plays an important role in this. Temporary open-closed estuaries are far more susceptible. They've got longer residence times and allow for the translation between nutrient inputs and ultimate algal mass. Also in our context, and slightly different to some of the warm and cool temperate Cape estuaries, is that when our systems tend to be more freshwater dominated, which has implications when we look at what's coming out of the effluents from wastewater treatment works, which tends to be quite rich in orthophosphates, so results in significant blooms at times. And that's just some of the results from the study, and those figures were at the time the highest ever recorded in in South African estuaries. So what's happening about it? Department of Water Affairs sets a guideline of 1 milligram per litre of orthophosphate in the final effluent. However, data supplied by eThekwini Water and Sanitation Department revealed that only one of our 19 works could be considered to fall within this threshold. And when you convert these data into kilograms, you actually can see how systems are being fertilized. This is an example of the Schlonga. This has changed in recent times, but at the time of doing this project, we had 145 kilograms of orthophosphates going into the Schlonga each day, where if we were sticking to the guideline, it would be around 21 kilograms per day. So this is all biologically reactive phosphorus. Okay. So in terms of some of the plans going forward, there's a plan to do a pilot orthophosphate removal project on the Mshloti system. It's been highlighted by numerous authors as having major eutrophication issues. Currently going into the system have around 30 or 28 kilograms of orthophosphates going into the system, whereas if we're looking at complying with the DWA guidelines, it should be in the order of 6.7. So need to sort it out somehow there. And the plan is to retrofit some of these works with aluminum sulfate dosing tanks, which will precipitate out the phosphates out the system. So just looking at initial costing in terms of how much this will cost, we're looking at around 450 Rand a day to do both works. So when you consider what kind of positive impact it could have and also what the costs are for running the works, it's actually very minor. Right. The green drop process, I'm sure some of you know about, is that DWA essentially give out green drop certificates or statuses to works that are considered to be fairly well functioning. However, the criteria I'm still confused about in terms of what they actually use. Our works, I think around 80% of our wastewater treatment works have green drop status, yet you look at the data that I've just presented around the nutrients and not one of them complies with the guidelines. So they're literally just looking at standard effluent requirements, which has actually very little to do with the receiving environment. So to me, this needs to be addressed, and needs to look at deeply at what the criteria should be for assigning these statuses. And the municipality puts great emphasis, and they set their targets based on the number of green drops that they get each year. So there's big incentive in order to change these. There's a desperate need for estuarine receiving water quality guidelines. I know we have them for freshwater and the marine environment. But obviously, because estuaries are so dynamic, it's obviously quite difficult to set water quality guidelines for them. And one size fits all is probably not going to suit estuaries. But it's pointless getting these figures down to what DWA says in terms of their guidelines, if we don't actually know what the loading is actually in the system. So we might not be having a major impact. Estuarine reserves have been discussed. My feeling is that there needs to be more integration in terms of nutrient loading into the scenarios run in reserve determinations. And if there's positive outcomes from the removal of nutrients at these works, then, and given the cost factor, I don't see any reason why they can't be fitted across the municipality. In terms of freshwater supply, Tuki's discussed in a fair amount of detail. The major thing I wanted to discuss here was around the additional water, the fact that we're living in a water-stressed country, and yet we've got some systems that are receiving too much water as a result of wastewater treatment work. So we've got a lot of these smaller catchments aren't suitable for dams, but they seem to be suitable for wastewater, and so it results in a system like the Mshlonga, like Tiki was describing, in which at one point it had 57% increase in terms of the fresh water entering the system. Now, how this impacted in terms of the functioning of the system, this is just a table showing 3 different studies that were done on the Mshlonga. In terms of the effluent going into each one of them, during 1978, during Alan Whitfield's PhD, there was 0 effluent virtually going into the system. During 1990 to 1992, which was Trevor Harrison's MSc, there's about 10 megalitres per day going into the system, and 20 in the last one. So when you look at the changes in mouth condition, you can see that they had a major impact as you move through. But what was particularly concerning was around the residence times. In our temporary open-closed estuaries, the closed phase, which is generally associated with low flow conditions during winter, is hugely important for a lot of our estuarine resident fish, which take advantage of these stable conditions to breed. It's also highly productive. So massively important. And we saw between the last two studies a major change in fish communities. In Trevor Harrison's study, we found that the estuarine round herring, Gilchristella aestuaria, was dominant in terms of abundance, representing over 50% of the total catch, whereas in the last study I think I picked up one or two individuals. So the species is a weak swimming taxa that is highly affected by changes in hydrodynamics and would have easily been swept out of the system and not given enough time basically to complete its life cycle. So what has taken place? This was a major, as Tiki was mentioning, there was a major transfer scheme between the Mshlonga to the Mgani system in the order of 25 million rand, which was championed by Bill Pfaff from Water and Sanitation Department. And the system is really displaying some degree of improvement. I know Tiki and Nicolette are working on the system and have already seen changes in terms of mouth condition and also recovery of invert communities. But obviously monitoring is still required in order to get the message out there, because there's been a massive capital investment, so there needs to be kind of some strong data to support it. And just a need for a look at all 16 systems within the metro and look at a total water budget, if you like, because we can't have a situation where we've got complete water deficits in one catchment versus other ones which we've got too much water in. And so this is just the other threats I haven't obviously had enough time to deal with, but there's just a picture of some sand mining, which is a major issue within our context and something that's pretty high on our agenda. Estuarine management plans, these are done, they've been done at varying levels. Cape are far ahead of us, but we've got 3 currently, well, 2 have been completed, 1's currently in production. We see this as a major opportunity moving forward and looking at a single plan, getting everyone involved and dealing with these issues, but we'll see if anything comes of it. And lastly, maintaining and restoring estuarine processes. It's pointless, as Tiki's saying, just put a fence around an estuary and hope that it's going to look after itself. It's not a terrestrial environment, so you've got to look after the processes that are actually driving the systems. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cameron. Got time for a question or two? Bruce, who's got the speaker over there?
I don't know if you heard Tamsin Livingston's presentation this morning, where she was talking about rezoning the Alawal Shoal MPA and the possible inclusion of the Mashongwa and the Mashongwana estuaries into that system. And I noticed on your ranking there, the 2 further up are also some of the best estuaries in terms of condition. Would you feel that it would be worthwhile conserving those estuaries and including them in some sort of protected area?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, they are some of our better systems in better condition. It's just, I mean, the difficulty with estuaries is again looking at what the threats are to them, and the majority of the threats are actually not direct impacts. So it's further up in the catchment. So to me, if you're keeping those processes and dealing with those processes, you're going a long way towards estuarine management. But yeah, I mean, of course, more protection, more kind of more better, pretty much.
Any other questions? Right the back. Santosh.
Thanks, Cameron. Your 5-meter contour, the line in the sand, as you call it, is that the actual delineation? I was always under the impression that that line excludes, refers to the estuarine functional zone and excludes the buffer around it. And at Tekwini, were wanting to use the 8-meter contour.
Yeah, the 8-meter contour came about. That's actually, I think it was Andrew Mather's baby. I think that was a result in the permanently open systems, basically looking at the 5-meter contour, which is highly applicable to our temporary open closed estuaries, but might not be big enough in our permanently open systems, which are far more susceptible to floods and that kind of impact. So yeah, I don't know where the 8-meter contour is or anything like that, but in terms of, from our perspective, we use the 5-meter contour.